and welcome to another exciting episode of Mehfil. My name is Amrita Ghosh, and today I get to revisit that moment in my childhood when I would lay awake in bed, scared because I had been just told a ghost story. And I have no doubts that this sounds familiar to you all. South Asia has a long history of such storytelling, and our guests today are two women who really enjoy writing about ghosts, haunted houses, and a whole range of spooky things. But this is also their way of reflecting on regional histories and traumatic pasts. We are calling this episode Bhoot, Prayt, Ghosts and Zombies, and we will talk about horror in South Asian literature and what it all means. Sehyr Mirza, writer and journalist, joins us from Lahore, Pakistan, and Jessica Faleiro is here from Goa, India. Welcome to the studio, Jessica and Sehyr.
Thanks for having us, Amrita.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you for having us here.
I am very excited because I've brought you together for a really masala topic, right? Writing horror and ghost stories. How did you both even get interested in this?
So I could go first, if you allow me, Sarah. Okay. Again, thanks for the invitation to talk about one of my favorite subjects. It was the topic of my first book, but to answer your question, how did I get into it? So when I was 10, I actually had what I would call a ghostly encounter or a paranormal occurrence or whatever. And since that moment, I have been fascinated with and interested in listening to other people's stories. And so over a period of like 3 decades, I was just collecting other people's stories and listening to what they had to say. And so there was a lot of learning that kind of went into this book. And the stories in my book are also little bits of, nuggets of all these stories that were told to me. So yeah, it was a personal thing that led to creating this book.
And they're spooky, I can tell you that. Sehyr?
Yeah. So, thank you again for having me here. And it's very exciting to be speaking to both of you. And it's always a pleasure to be in a literary company. Yeah. So, in my case, I don't think it was an intentional choice. But maybe the subconscious mind has a role to play here. We all grow up listening to stories from our grandparents. In my case, it was, the time that I've spent in childhood with my grandmother. And all these stories that I've heard from her are so alive in my memory. My grandmother was born and raised in Kota, Rajasthan. And the memories from her hometown during the pre-partition times used to be my bedtime stories. So my mind would kind of, vividly visualize the narration of her memories from Kota. And, it was... Sometimes she would also talk about the horrifying tales from the partition of India. So, when it was the time when the riots and the atrocities broke out in the 1947. Sure. So these stories brought alive the trauma of the partition. And I think at a very early age, I witnessed the partition, the anger, the sorrow, the wounds of it through my grandmother's eyes. And I believe that the partition of India was the biggest horror faced by the people of the subcontinent. So it was an event that kind of, it is considered as the greatest human tragedies in human history. And therefore, when I read the stories written about the partition of India, I think of stories written about, horror. And when I read Manto, Dedi, Krishan Chandar, let's suppose Amrita Pritam. So all of these stories carry the lived horror experiences of people of the subcontinent. So I think we can draw correlations here between horror and the writings around the partition of India. So this is how I look at it. This is what got me into it somehow.
Right. And I wanted to follow up immediately when Jessica, you said that you had a specific ghostly encounter, and I want to go to that. But in a way, both of you have said that your motivations to come to this topic are different. And I've often heard that, writers of horror are working through their own fears. And I'm recalling Stephen King famously saying something along the lines that, he began writing to drown the scariness in his mind. And, I've read both of your work, and you just mentioned, Sehyr, the motivation for your writing was the horror of the partition and what went along with the violence. And Jessica, your stories are situated with the family, the secrets, love and longing, and the loss. Sehyr, your story, The Ghost, is about the ghost within, and you just mentioned about this traumatic past that we have had in both our countries. Are there any other motivations specifically, and you both can draw in on and extend from what you just said, Sehyr, and Jessica, you can talk about your own other motivations.
Okay, so I guess similar to what Sehyr said earlier, there's a subconscious element that kind of enters into it. And so for me, the driving motivation from an emotional point of view was I had this encounter. So then I can talk about it now, actually.
Please do. I'd love to hear.
So I've done a long interview, which is on YouTube, which actually at the Goa Arts and Literature Festival in 2012, which is still on YouTube, which actually talks about this. But in brief, I was, I grew up and lived in Kuwait for a long time, and we were on holiday in my grandmother's village in Goa visiting. And then in the afternoon, the family were finishing up lunch. I'd already eaten. I went to the backyard. And the house that was beyond our boundary wall belonged to an old miserly uncle who had passed away many years ago and had been boarded up. And so imagine in an afternoon with the dead of air, sort of, there's no breeze, no wind, nothing. It's about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. That's the time when everything goes still, and then the wind picks up again later. I was looking towards the house, knowing that nobody lives there, and just inside the closed window pane, I could see a lace curtain moving. And I knew that nobody was there. There's no wind in the air. I was very rational, even as a child. And I'm assessing the atmospheric conditions. And I had no explanation for what I was seeing. And then as I kept looking, the curtain moves and I can see a rocking chair inside that starts moving. So I was just freaked out. And the whole thing is very visibly boarded up. There was no rational explanation. And the hairs on the back of my neck rose, and then on the back of my arms rose. And the funny thing is, since that point, whenever I do talk to people about their stories, that's a very common thread for people, especially rationalists, when they're having an encounter. They say and then the hair on the back of my neck rose up or whatever.
I just had goosebumps too when you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can visualize what's happening, actually. And then I actually dragged my mother out and told her what I was seeing. But of course, everything was still again and nothing was moving. But the story goes on, and cut to 9 years later, I find out from my grandmother that there have been sightings around that house of various things. And I swore to my grandmother and my father that I was not visiting my grandmother's house again. And I cannot stand to be, it's our ancestral house, I cannot stand to be around there anymore. And even when I was writing the stories, I had to stop at 5 o'clock every evening before dark, because my imagination was so switched on, so vivid. I would remember this story. I would remember other people's stories as well. So from an emotional point of view, in a way, I was exorcising that event and that story from my system. But from a more practical point of view, when I started listening to other people talking about their stories and sharing their stories with me, the funny thing was I realized that, we do have a strong tradition and a culture of people talking about whatever is on their mind. And, the ghost story stuff is very vivid and lively and vibrant for people. But I realized that we moved into a culture, and it's across the world, not just South Asia, where people hold back from telling you these stories. That's been my experience. But then when you share something, they feel this huge relief and permission given to then speak about what they've experienced. And it was incredible to me. Like, I used to go on work trips all over the world. And in Malawi, in Bangladesh, we used to go on very long car drives to get to where we had to go to do work, development field, international development stuff. And on those rides, I would be like, okay, close your books. We're not doing any more meeting discussions. Tell me your ghost stories. And oh my God, the next 5 hours of endless stories. And you can't believe the stuff people have encountered. Well, what I realized is there are a lot of similar motifs, but also tropes that come up for people. The abandoned house, the animal possessed by human spirit. That's, Celtic tradition, any tradition, Pacific Islands, they all have these similar tropes coming out in their stories, ghost stories.
This is really fascinating. And, when you were both speaking, I also caught that you both were talking about your grandmothers and the stories that came from her, which is fascinating as well. But, Jessica, you mentioned something also particularly interesting in the South Asian tradition, which is the tradition of orality, right? When you were talking about this story, I was thinking about the story that I heard within the family. I don't know from where, from my grandmother, then my mother, and trickling down to me, about the house across that had nobody residing in it, and yet there was something going on. So we've heard these kinds of stories in oral traditions. And I'm thinking iconic stories, like in Bengali tradition, we have the Grandmother's Basket of Stories by Dakshina Ranjan Mitra Majumdar, very famous. It's called Thakur Marchuli. And there's some, horror subgenres associated with it, where the animal is kind of haunted. And there, of course, Vikram and Betal in the tradition. And the tradition of storytelling passes from this generational context. But do you both then use this oral tradition, or how do you both this oral tradition specifically in Indian or Pakistani context? And I know, Jessica, you mentioned beyond that also, but how do we then use orality within the traditions that we have in India and Pakistan in your writing?
Yeah. So as for storytelling, it is an integral part of the tradition of South Asia. And I think stories are transferred from generation to generation. And that's exactly how intergenerational traumas are transferred between generations. And I think I would like to mention Shakespeare's Hamlet here, because I think that was somehow running in my mind when I was thinking of developing this story, The Ghost. And Hamlet is the best known revenge tragedies ever produced till date. But I also see it as a story about intergenerational traumas. So it's like the trauma which has passed from one generation to the other. Like the ghost of the Hamlet's father, which appears in the beginning of the play. And he reveals that he's actually not been, it was not a natural death, but he's been murdered by his brother. So this is the truth of his father's murder, which continues to haunt Hamlet for the rest of his life. So in this way, I think the ghost of the partition, it continues to haunt the people of the subcontinent, and it kind of creates a fear in the minds of the people. And this fear is of an imagined enemy, which in case of Pakistan is India, and in case of India is Pakistan. So this is the fear of an imagined enemy, which the ghost in my story also kind of represents. And as this fear, actually, it is the fear in us, which is created by the states, propagated by the media houses, and it is the fear which is then, leads to the hatefulness that people carry in their minds or their hearts. So it is again the aspect of the oral tradition, the passing down of stories from one generation to the other, the horror stories of partition, which kind of plays a role in this aspect. And also, if I speak of my writings, I spoke about the stories that I've heard from my grandmother, and they've had a very profound impact on my work and my writings, which is visible. Also, there is an interesting aspect here that Hamlet's father uh, was poisoned in his ears. Poison was poured in his ears, and I think here we can draw synergies with the fact that how our states and how the media houses, which act as state machineries in both the countries, they kind of poison the ears of the people in both the countries, and this is the way they keep us divided, because there are too many similarities. We have a shared history, a shared culture.
Completely.
We have a common language, but it is the political lies or the historical lies which are told to us, which keep us divided then, and this is kind of poisoning of ears. And this was that we got to see in Hamlet as well. So I think that was somehow uh, playing in my mind.
I find it very interesting, Sehyr, that you are actually drawing your sort of motivations from, of course, the great Hamlet plot and the revenge tragedies that you spoke about. Um, and I also think that it's kind of the hauntings that I'm thinking completely of the remaking of Hamlet in the subcontinent, especially within Kashmir. It's recreated this
Yes.
fantastic film Heather, and how it has been uh, sort of recrafted into Hamlet's revenge tragedy, but talking about the hauntings in Kashmir specifically. But I also want to talk about the title of your book. I mean, I read The Ghost and I really liked it.
Yeah.
But the title of your book is The Other in the Mirror, which is a very spooky and eerie title. Am I right to think then you're working specifically with the historical trauma? Can you talk to us about the title and the other stories?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so first of all, thank you for reading the story and for the appreciation. It really means a lot. And yes, you're right. I am working with the themes of intergenerational trauma, loss, nostalgia, and migration. And all of these are kind of dominant themes in the stories in the anthology as well. So, talking about the title of the anthology, it has a deeper meaning. It somehow depicts the urge in the people on both the sides of the border to point out the flaws in the other, and this this common act of transferring the blame and the responsibility from ourselves to the other. So this is exactly what we get to see happening in a lot of the verbal heated exchanges between the politicians, politicians of the two countries. And as I mentioned earlier, the media houses exactly do the same. So it's like a mirror image.
Yes.
The title actually means that when you are pointing one finger at the other, there are three fingers that are pointing back at you. So it is in fact a reflection of yourself that you see in the mirror, and which you think is the other, but that's actually you yourself.
Exactly.
So that it points out to the similarities that we have. Even our hatred is so similar. So you get to see this mirror effect in most of the stories in the anthology. Whether so these two countries are like can be seen as identical twins. Sometimes they are imitating each other, and despite the point of separation, the circumstances that led to their separation, since they have a shared past, they have common roots, so that's what binds them together as well. And this is what is they remain on somehow on parallel lines in understanding each other as well, while remaining very distant from it. So
I really love the fact that you talked about the syncretic shared past, but how they haunt us into dividing in this kind of creation of the other. It's fascinating. Jessica, I'm going to turn to your book. I really enjoyed it, Afterlives.
Thank you.
Part of it, you also answered that, there are these stories in the family. I was also struck by how Goa, as the space itself, as a rich historical space, lends itself to the stories interweaved in so many different ways, in so many different shorter plots and segments. And I'm even told that there are ghost stores in the city. Can you say a bit more about Goa and horror specifically?
Sure. Yeah. So if you look at Gothic fiction and the elements of Gothic fiction, then you do have a new burgeoning kind of area of South Asian Gothic, and then I've been reading about Bombay Gothic, and so I'm actually writing work on Goan Gothic. There's Bangkok Gothic. There's a lot of stuff going on, and the specificity of Goan Gothic being, yes, there is this commonality of the Gothic elements of demons and curses and ghosts and monsters and all that sort of part of it, and then the common themes of betrayal, loss, desire, revenge, isolation, disbelonging and dislocation, those kinds of things, and then you have the more let's say post-colonial aspects. So
Yes.
with Goa, particularly, unlike most of the rest of India, we were colonized by the Portuguese, and so there's a very different feel and texture and impact on the literature as well, on Goan literature, of which there is some cultural production happening. I think the scale needs to go up and improve. And then within that, as we know, you mentioned Vikram and Betal. It's one of the first noted written stories, going back to, 10th or 11th century, 11th, I think, in the Katha Sarat Sagar, of a ghost story. So, but since then, between then and like 100 years from then, it's just stayed in the oral tradition of storytelling and being passed down. And like Sehyr said, the intergenerational trauma of all the dislocation and the belonging and the wars between dynasties and colonialism after that, it has all kind of been infused, if we just want to narrate through the lens of the ghost stories, which are very powerful and heady things, if you want to see them as a literary device in their own right. I mean, so my stories, I won't talk about all of them. I mean, well, there's a frame. So the stories very naturally came to me that there was a family
Yes.
that were going to be exchanging these stories to each other. So there's a frame narrative, just
And I
as
love
there is
that.
with. Yeah, it worked very well. So I actually did it as the first book was a thesis I did as my part of my MA in creative writing, and I had a tutor that didn't tell me what it needed, but sort of steered me towards lots of different things that ended up being interesting frame narratives. And it made sense to me that there was going to be this story, this family, and they're a diaspora family, which is a very strong part of the Goan culture historically. We have been known to be on caravels, Portuguese caravels, and we travel, and we were the first, like among the first migrants to the Gulf, and all this sort of thing. So Goans themselves are not that insular with their country. They are happy to, get on a ship, get on a flight, get away, and come back. But they're happy with, so mobility has been a big part of Goan culture, and the Goan diaspora a big part of it as well. So my book is seen through, like, one lens is diaspora literature, then Goan literature, post-colonial literature, but then also, and particularly Luso in the Indo-Portuguese literature. But then it's also been captured in narratives of the Indian Ocean because of the movement. And if you talk about the just the colonial aspect, one of the stories, and this is what I wanted to say, the beginning. So this is a story of family secret, and the beginning is the start of the secret. That sort of goes through, I think it's 3 generations. I even forget. I think it's 3 generations or 4 generations of the Fonseca family. And the secret comes out in the midst of this storytelling that happens where everyone sort of starts swapping stories. And towards the end, the patriarch says, well, if you really want a story, here's, the secret of the family, and do with it what you will. And the beginning is actually talking about intergenerational trauma and historical perspective. I played with a timeline to do with the Portuguese Inquisition, which is something almost nobody has written about and very little captured in literary fiction.
Yes.
And it's the story of the Sephardic Jews. So the Inquisition was actually invited to Goa to handle or take care of or weed out the Sephardic Jews that were escaping persecution from Spain and Portugal, and then came to Goa to make their living through the trade routes, and then ended up having the Inquisition come to Goa and follow them there and try, actually put them through the lens of the Inquisition to test whether they were actually in the Catholic faith or pretending to be. And so that was the birth of the Inquisition in Goa. But a lot of people, most people, have forgotten that narrative and think that it came just to what should I say, to as part of the Hindu and Catholic kind of divide, to create and solidify that divide. And that was not the inception of the Inquisition in Goa. It took a few years, few decades, before it then widened its remit. So that was important for me to sort of play with the timeline a bit. But I put that into the literary fiction format. And that is the most obvious, I think, to me, political intergenerational trauma kind of story. And the horrors of the Inquisition are kind of documented. So that's actually a story I bring alive in there, where there's a priest. He's not a perfect man. He's a complex person. And this whole Fonseca family has actually, spoiler alert, has been birthed through his infidelity to his faith, in a way, if you want to characterize it that way.
As you were talking, I was also thinking somebody needs to do a film on this. The Fonseca family is so interesting, and we spoke about this first here. But, I love the fact that perhaps then your motivations are not so different from each other. There is this kind of history of colonialism and the intergenerational trauma that you're working with in specifically different ways, or the rhetoric is slightly different, forms are different. And I'm also thinking, if you think about the South Asian works or writings, specifically, as Jessica, you mentioned that there's now this Bombay Gothic, which I was not privy to. So that sounds fascinating. If you can talk to us more about.
It's mostly a film thing. It's been captured in the 1950s vintage Hindi films onwards. So yeah.
And we're talking about popular Hindi films, the ghost stories and the hauntings and the empty houses kind of.
Yes, the abandoned old house in the middle of Bombay that no one touches and knows about, but it's chock-a-block full of all sorts of creepy things. And,
and the new residents come in and things happen in their lives, right? But I'm also thinking in the South Asian tradition, we have this recurring symbol of this tree, the ancient tree, the banyan, or other trees that are source of this spirit or jinns or ghosts inhabiting the tree. And it's such an interesting trope where such a regenerative symbol is now then used as a source of fear or horror, usually of the other. And I think, Sehyr, your story, The Ghost, also has this, border no man's land where there's, the sightings of this ghost is around a tree. What do you think of this recurring trope?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. Also, because I think the subconscious also plays a role here. When it's interesting that my story begins with a tree. And yeah,
That's
so yeah. So in India and Pakistan, trees are often used in ghost stories, like you just said, and I think it's because of the cultural significance and sometimes the beliefs surrounding them.
hmm.
So they've played a significant role in the history and the mythology of these two countries, and sometimes the trees are also considered sacred in many traditions. So, like in Hindu mythology, trees are associated with various, perhaps, gods and goddesses, and they are seen as, you know, as um, believed to have certain specific powers and properties. Similarly, if we speak of the Sufi tradition, so the trees are also regarded as sacred, and Sufi saints, used to believe that they have meditative properties, and sometimes miracles happen under trees. So. Also, I think there's another aspect to it, that if we talk of the rural areas in both the countries, trees are also the focal points of community gatherings and sometimes rituals, and so the importance of trees is like deeply ingrained in the culture. So maybe that's the reason why we get to see the trees as a recurring element in the ghost stories, and also this is how they kind of reflect the tension between the modernity and the tradition, and
Mm.
how we are like sticking to the old beliefs, our superstitious beliefs, so which are deep rooted, just like these trees are rooted in
Mm.
our
Amazing.
yeah. So this is what I think.
I think that's true. I mean, I never thought about, it's not just the haunting of something fearful, but also kind of, as you mentioned, the question of miracles that, I
Yes.
think there are ruins and spaces at graves where people come to pray even to the jinns, right? Like for miracles or fulfillment of prayers. So that's so true. Uh,
Yeah.
Jessica?
Yeah, so something slightly different struck me when you mentioned the regenerative symbolism of trees. And what came to my mind is, I think you mentioned rebirth as well, which is a very strong symbolic thing that you see in a lot of like religious
Yes,
kind of
absolutely.
symbolism. What struck me is, it reminded me of a conversation I had with an author friend recently, where in her book, it's not really about ghosts and all, but there's a small bit that's like related to haunting. And I asked her about it because of my curiosity. And what she describes is something that she told me actually was based on stories she collected from her local village, where people, the last generation, used to see what they thought were coffins traveling over the roofs of houses. And it all was a sort of a foreshadowing of someone's death, a very sudden, usually brutal death. And she said, I explored this imagery that people were leaving me with, and they had a very strong belief, the last generation, that they were seeing this and what it was accurate and true, because immediately after they were relating it to some burglary that had happened and somebody had been killed rather brutally or something. And she said she realized that overlaid with the time during just around the Second World War. Goa wasn't really actively a part of it, but because it was part of Portugal and sort of neutral compared to the rest of Anglo India, it was used as a base, a neutral base. And so people would see planes flying overnight. And it looked like, so when they, from the angle where they stood, as they looked up to the rooftops, it looked like coffins traveling over the tops of the roofs.
Uh,
And she said the thing is, it stayed in their psyche because this was a time of large upheaval. It was still before the rule of Salazar or under the rule of Salazar. It was a horrible dictator in Portugal, but the Goans seemed to think he was A-okay. And at the same time, it played in their psyches and something stayed in it because it was a time of upheaval, uncertainty, and change. And she was saying to me that she researched this, and I think it was Freudian. Her research was Freudian in that it was known that during a time of upheaval and change and uncertainty, people had sort of these deeply embedded hauntings and very brutal imagery that would stay in their minds. And it was very sort of psychosomatic, but it was created in their mind and they thought it was real. And so in their minds, these were real occurrences.
But these were dreams actually that happened to the folks.
Not dreams. So not dreams. They were seeing the planes flying over.
As a collective village.
They believed they were coffins traveling over the edges of the roofs.
That is fascinating.
The child's roof. And so it stayed in the psyche and it moved into the next generation as, oh, when I was young, this is what we saw. And then somebody died in the village, which is like the Chinese whisper kind of thing. But actually she researched it and found out there was this political background to it. And it's because of the uncertainty and the levels of fear and anxiety in people that this emotionality actually gets converted into this haunting in their head. And so they try to make sense of it by, creating this paranormal thing around it, which I found very interesting. But when you said the rebirth and you talked about trees, it reminded me of how a tree being, linked to rebirth and change and the uncertainty around change. Not many can't handle that. People can't handle change. They don't like change. They want to reject it. They find ways to deal with it. They find ways to not deal with it. And so it reminded me of this story of how people were just so frightened of change that they rewrote things in their head as hauntings.
I'm thinking about what Jessica, you said that this is, there's a lot of work happening in horror and suddenly emergent kinds of horror in South Asia, beyond what we have seen in Bollywood, popular Hindi films. And I recently saw this award-winning film. I think it won a couple of awards in Bangladesh. It's called Moshari, the Mosquito Net. And it was the only qualified film that was qualified for Oscars. And it's a very creepy film and has, again, the past of colonialism, neo-colonialism, climate change weaved into it. And it seems like we're seeing more and more films like these coming up in the South Asian context and also fiction itself. Do you see that there's some kind of a trend in Pakistan, Sehyr, or in India, Jessica?
Okay, so I have to say that I don't watch a lot of Indian cinema. But I am aware that there is more being captured, but I think that's been a long time coming, where ghost stories have sat within the oral storytelling tradition for the longest time ever, especially compared to other genres of fiction. And now we're seeing more coming out. I mean, I think in Europe, in the UK, in the US, they've established it over the last 20, 30 years probably, and it's one of the most popular modes of entertainment. And now Indian cinema, South Asian cinema is picking up on this trend. They want to capitalize on it. Yeah. I think that we're still not seeing, where the literary form could there's so much space for it to explode, actually. Absolutely. And we're still not seeing that. But I think it'll come slowly. Yeah.
Sehyr?
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning this interesting film from Bangladesh. I would like to watch it. Sounds interesting.
I think it's on YouTube. I think it's now available on YouTube.
Oh, it is? Oh.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, so I think horror has always been a popular genre in South Asian cultures, with stories of ghosts dating back centuries. But I also think that, the rise of digital media and a lot of streaming platforms that we have now it has kind of made these horror films more accessible to people, and now we also see a very growing demand for such new or innovative content. So maybe that's also an aspect, but horror genre has always also been used as a tool for social commentary, which is also in case of my story. So exploring issues of gender, caste, religion, or so that also plays a role, and this allows filmmakers and writers to not only entertain but also educate and raise awareness about important social issues, perhaps.
I do agree. I mean, I do think it's there historically, but also, as Jessica, you also mentioned that it's a trope and a genre that has not been really there in the writing so much. And I'm also interested through the conversation we are talking about how they have resistant possibilities. They are rethinking the past and its impact on the present. But do these stories also allow us to overcome these fears, the fears of the unknown, or do they instill new fears amongst us? How do you both as writers walk this line when you write about these topics?
Do they instill new fears? I think because literary fiction will always move, like Sehyr said as well, into a social commentary of the time, and history will repeat itself. So literary fiction will, I suppose, repeat some of the lessons that have not been learned. But that will always be imbued, whether it's ghost stories or any kind of fiction. I mean, ghost stories sort of written well that kind of do the job that they want to do, but this underlying subtext being there's this socio-political commentary that wants to be seen. So yeah, I think, and will it instill new fears? Look at the lives we're living and the world we're living. And you mentioned climate change earlier, and I'm not sure, I haven't yet read, not to say that they're not out there, but I haven't yet read a climate change ghost story kind of thing yet. And yet there are hauntings around what is happening with climate change, and it's a serious kind of horror for many people, haunting many people, definitely creates a huge amount of social anxiety for people. So yeah, it is, the new fear is there, and that will be imbued into a ghost story or literary fiction or whatever, I think. Maybe that's a challenge for me to attempt that next. I don't know, yeah. But,
Thank you, Jessica. Sehyr?
Yeah, okay. Amrita, can you repeat this question once for me?
Sure. I'm thinking of, you're both working on all of these stories that are resistant in some ways and rethinking the past and its impact on the present. But how do you then think about these stories also creating new fears? Do they instill new fears in us? How do you write about them so that, these kinds of divisions are not propagated even more?
Yeah, so in my case, like you said earlier, my story has political implications, and so it can be seen as a political satire as well. So
True.
yeah, so it is talking about creating new fears is in this case is not so apt, but I think. That like I spoke earlier about the horrors of the partition that continue to haunt us. So in this case, I think, which was the main idea behind this anthology as well, that we need to get over all of this hatefulness, and we need to create healing spaces. And the best way to do this is by pushing ahead the narrative of love and compassion. And the fear that I have in me is I get really afraid of the hatefulness. When I get to see people trolling on social media, the increasing hateful narrative that is pushed in both the countries. So that is the kind of fear which I carry, and this was my way of dealing with that.
I
This
agree
is
with you. Yes.
yeah, put it, yeah. So
And I
that's
also
how.
like the fact that it's a satire, so that it's actually the fear within us, right?
Yes, fear within us, absolutely.
Jessica?
Oh, well, I don't really have anything to add about
I
that, but
ask you both one final question,
yeah.
and that would be: is there one favorite ghost story that you have? I am thinking about, in my case, it would be one of the stories of Ruskin Bond that I grew up with. Is there one favorite story that you both can recall?
Which is the Ruskin Bond one of yours?
I think the man with no eyes, the one.
Uh,
Oh, I don't know that one. I've read all his. I thought I'd read all his ghost stories. Okay, maybe if you told
Really,
me,
really
I'd see
creepy
it
one.
again. But yeah. Okay. Um, okay. I have one called "The Ghost Who Fell in Love," which is written by Vinita Coelho, who is a screenwriter and lots of things, but she's very good at the visual image. It's a story with almost no dialogue. It's set in some era in northern India. It feels like it's old worldly and all these labyrinthine rooms, but it's essentially a story about a ghost that sees a newlywed bride brushing her hair on the terrace and then falls in love with her and then obsesses over her and then follows her. And it's a story about domestic violence. So through the ghost's eyes, we see domestic violence, between this newlywed couple playing out, and how you see the patriarchal elements playing out, and how the women support the patriarchy. And there's this very subtle but sometimes not so subtle violence in the story, which isn't explicit, very nuanced, beautifully handled. And for me, it's essentially a story about the existence or non-existence or non-acknowledgement of female desire. And the story ends in a very open-ended way with the new bride, who was attached to her husband, now moving away from the husband towards the presence that she becomes aware of this ghost. And yeah, it's an incredible story. She becomes attached to something she cannot see, but she knows is there. And it's just very
Isn't
powerful. And I teach it.
Oh, you do. But isn't
Yeah,
there a
I
similar
teach it.
story? I'm thinking of the film, and I cannot recall the film. It was qualified and went to the Oscars and didn't win it. From Shah Rukh Khan and Rani Mukherjee, and Shah Rukh Khan is the ghost figure, falls in love with Rani Mukherjee and follows her.
yeah, I think they're called Paheli.
Paheli, that's the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I have to see
It's a
that.
very,
Okay.
very similar trope.
Yes.
It wouldn't surprise me if it was actually Vinita's story, because she writes for Bollywood. She's a screenwriter for Bollywood, actually.
I would
However,
to
the
find
most
out.
interesting thing for me is we didn't mention this earlier, and about the tropes of ghost stories and female sexuality. Well, dark desires in
Yes,
general, if you look at European
yes,
Gothic, but female sexuality and female desire in particular being
absolutely.
that's a huge interest for me in how it's captured, and in ghost stories it can be handled very well, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good reminder that the desire does play into South Asian narratives of the other female haunting. Yes. Seher, any favorites?
I think it's a bit difficult to pick one, but I think I've been quite intrigued by the Gothic literature written during the Victorian era. So the what comes to my mind is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, perhaps. Yeah.
The
I,
classic Gothics.
yeah, and I also think that there were gloomy and gothic elements that can be seen in the writings of Charles Dickens as well.
Mm,
So maybe Bleak House and Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol.
Christmas
But
Carol. Yeah.
yes, completely. And I do
so
have to say, when I first read Wuthering Heights, that hand that knocked at the window with the winds howling, that
Oh
image stayed
God.
the longest time in my head.
That is actually like one of the creepiest books, and
Yes,
atmosphere done so well.
so much.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Again, like, it lends itself to the story, the setting itself completely. But thank
When
you
you
both
said
for.
Victorian, when you said Victorian, you actually reminded me, one of my other faves is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James,
Mm.
who wasn't set in the Victoria, but yet it is a very Victorian story. And I love it because it's a novella, but it's open to
It's
interpretation, and it all could have been psychosomatic. And that's the story that inspired me to write about psychological hauntings. I was like, oh, this is different. So yeah, but yeah, that reminded me.
Well, thank you both for a fantastic, very exciting episode at
Thank
Mehfil.
you. Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having me.
Thank you. Thank you.